The screams echoed through Kampala as Idi Amin's soldiers dragged another victim into the torture chambers. By 1979, Uganda's last king of Scotland had murdered over 300,000 of his own people and reduced one of Africa's most prosperous nations to a wasteland of terror and economic collapse. But Amin was just one of many dictators who didn't just oppress their people. They systematically destroyed the very countries they claimed to love. Throughout history, power has corrupted absolutely, but some leaders took that corruption to unimaginable extremes. These weren't just tyrants who oppressed their citizens. These were madmen who obliterated their own nations from within, leaving behind nothing but death, poverty, and broken societies. Today, we're diving into the most devastating cases of self-destruction by the world's most evil dictators. If you're fascinated by the dark side of history and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to explore these shocking true stories, and let me know in the comments which dictator's story shocked you the most. Now, let's begin this journey into madness. On April 17, 1975, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge forces marched into Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. Within hours, they began implementing one of history's most insane social experiments. Pol Pot, whose real name was Saloth Sar, had a vision: transform Cambodia into a pure agrarian society by eliminating everything modern, intellectual, or foreign. Born into a relatively prosperous farming family in 1925, Pol Pot had studied in Paris on a government scholarship in the 1940s and 1950s. Ironically, the man who would later murder anyone with education had received one of the best educations Cambodia could offer. In Paris, he was radicalized by communist ideology, but his interpretation was uniquely twisted and extreme. The madness started immediately after taking Phnom Penh. Soldiers forced the entire population of the capital, over 2 million people, to evacuate within 24 hours. Pregnant women gave birth on the roadside. Hospital patients were forced from their beds, many dying within hours of being moved. Families were deliberately separated as part of the regime's plan to destroy traditional social bonds. Children were marched away from their parents, often never to see them again. The evacuation itself was a death march. Khmer Rouge soldiers showed no mercy to the weak, elderly, or sick. Those who couldn't keep up were shot on the spot. Witnesses described seeing bodies lining the roads out of the city as desperate families dragged whatever possessions they could carry into an uncertain future in the countryside. Pol Pot's regime declared this Year Zero, the beginning of a new civilization where Cambodia's history would be erased and rewritten. But what followed was systematic genocide disguised as social engineering. The regime identified numerous categories of people to be eliminated: intellectuals, professionals, religious minorities, ethnic Vietnamese and Chinese, and anyone with connections to the previous government. The paranoia reached absurd levels. Anyone who wore glasses was executed for appearing intellectual. Speaking a foreign language, including French or English, meant certain death. Having soft hands indicated a life free from manual labor, another death sentence. Even crying for dead relatives was punishable by execution, as it showed attachment to the old society that Pol Pot was trying to destroy. Children became the regime's most effective weapon. Kids as young as 10 years old were recruited as soldiers and executioners. They were deliberately chosen because they could be molded into perfect instruments of the revolution, showing no mercy to their victims. These child soldiers were taught to murder their own parents if they showed any resistance to the regime. Parents lived in terror of their own children, who might report them for the smallest infraction. The killing fields became Cambodia's new reality, with execution sites scattered throughout the country. At Choang Ek, just one of hundreds of killing fields, archaeologists later found 8,985 bodies in mass graves. This site alone contained evidence of systematic torture and execution. Victims were beaten to death with farming tools like hoes and axes to save ammunition. Bullets were considered too valuable to waste on executions. The brutality was methodical and efficient. Babies and small children were grabbed by their legs and swung against trees until their skulls cracked open. Pregnant women had their stomachs sliced open, and their unborn children killed before their eyes. The phrase, "to spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss," became the regime's motto, demonstrating the complete devaluation of human life. Agricultural production, supposedly the focus of the new society, collapsed completely under the weight of forced labor and ignorance. City dwellers with no farming experience were forced to work in rice paddies under impossible quotas. When harvests failed, the Khmer Rouge blamed sabotage and executed more enemies. The resulting famine killed hundreds of thousands more. Medical care became non-existent. Doctors had been murdered or fled. Traditional medicines were banned as backward superstition. People died from easily treatable diseases and infections. Childbirth became a death sentence for many mothers without proper medical care. Within 4 years, Pol Pot had murdered between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians, nearly 25% of the entire population. To put this in perspective, this percentage of death was higher than any other genocide in the 20th century, including the Holocaust. The infrastructure collapsed completely. Schools, hospitals, and factories were destroyed or abandoned. Currency was abolished, and all trade was conducted through government distribution systems that rarely functioned. Religion was systematically destroyed. Buddhist monks, who had been central to Cambodian culture for centuries, were murdered en masse. Temples were demolished or converted into prisons and execution sites. The regime went so far as to destroy ancient statues and historical monuments, attempting to erase any trace of Cambodia's pre-revolutionary identity. By 1979, when Vietnamese forces finally drove out the Khmer Rouge after a brief border war, Cambodia had been reduced to a Stone Age society. The educated class had been completely eliminated. The economy had ceased to exist in any meaningful form. An entire generation had grown up knowing only violence, starvation, and terror. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build was gone. Cultural traditions that had existed for centuries were lost forever. Pol Pot had achieved his goal of creating Year Zero, but in doing so, he had destroyed one of Southeast Asia's most beautiful and culturally rich nations. The Cambodia that emerged from his rule was a ghost of its former self, requiring decades of international assistance to rebuild even basic functions of society. Idi Amin Dada came to power in Uganda through a military coup on January 25, 1971. Initially, many Ugandans welcomed him, believing he would bring stability after years of political turmoil under Milton Obote. Instead, they got 8 years of the most brutal dictatorship Africa had ever seen, a reign of terror that would earn Amin the nickname, the Butcher of Uganda. Born around 1925 in northwestern Uganda, Amin was largely illiterate and had risen through the ranks of the British colonial army through physical strength and cunning rather than education. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 250 pounds, he was an imposing figure who used his physical presence to intimidate opponents. His lack of education would later contribute to the bizarre and irrational decisions that destroyed his country. Amin's paranoia manifested immediately after taking power. Within months, he began systematically eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat. Military officers who had served under the previous government were tortured and executed in gruesome ways. Some were forced to bludgeon each other to death with sledgehammers. Others were shot in the legs and forced to crawl until they died from blood loss. The killings weren't limited to political opponents. Intellectuals, journalists, religious leaders, and business people disappeared in the night. Amin's State Research Bureau, his secret police, operated torture chambers throughout the country. At the notorious Nakasero prison in Kampala, victims were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Electric shock torture was routine. Prisoners had their limbs broken systematically. Many were forced to eat pieces of their own flesh. But perhaps the most devastating single decision Amin made was the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population. In 1972, claiming he had received a divine vision from God, Amin announced that all Asians had to leave Uganda within 90 days. On August 4th, he declared that Uganda was for Black Africans only, and that the Asian community, which numbered approximately 80,000 people, was being expelled for their own safety. This wasn't a recent immigrant population. Asian families, primarily of Indian and Pakistani descent, had lived in Uganda for generations. They had built the railway system under British colonial rule. They owned shops, factories, and banks. They employed hundreds of thousands of Ugandans and formed the backbone of the country's economy. Many had been born in Uganda and considered it their only home. The expulsion was carried out with ruthless efficiency and breathtaking cruelty. Asian families were given just 90 days to liquidate their entire lives. They were allowed to take only the clothes on their backs and 50 pounds sterling per person. Everything else, homes, businesses, bank accounts, personal possessions, was confiscated by the state and redistributed to Amin's cronies and military supporters. The human cost of the expulsion was immediate and devastating. Families were separated as some members had citizenship in other countries while others didn't. Elderly people died from the stress of forced relocation. Businesses that had taken generations to build were abandoned overnight. The exodus created a massive refugee crisis as neighboring countries struggled to accommodate the displaced population. The economic impact was catastrophic and immediate. Asian-owned businesses, which generated an estimated 90% of Uganda's tax revenue, closed permanently. Factories shut down. The banking system collapsed when Asian-owned banks were seized and their managers fled. Supply chains that had taken decades to establish were destroyed overnight. Amin's military supporters and government officials, who received the confiscated Asian properties, had no idea how to run businesses or manage complex economic enterprises. Shops that had been profitable for decades became empty within weeks. Factories that had employed thousands of workers were stripped for scrap metal. The sophisticated import-export networks that had connected Uganda to world markets vanished. Within 6 months of the Asian expulsion, Uganda's economy had contracted by more than 30%. Inflation skyrocketed as basic goods became scarce. The Ugandan shilling became virtually worthless. International investors fled, and foreign aid dried up as the world watched Amin's increasingly erratic behavior with growing alarm. But the economic destruction was nothing compared to the human cost of Amin's increasingly psychotic behavior. His paranoia grew worse over time, leading to even more bizarre and brutal acts. He declared himself conqueror of the British Empire and demanded that British citizens living in Uganda carry him on a throne. When they refused, he had them executed. He claimed to be in direct communication with God and Adolf Hitler, often making major policy decisions based on these alleged conversations. The randomness of the violence became one of its most terrifying aspects. Entire villages were massacred based on rumors of disloyalty. Soldiers were given free rein to kill, rape, and loot with impunity. The military, once a professional force, became a gang of thugs who terrorized the civilian population. Roadblocks became execution sites where travelers were killed for no reason other than the whims of drunken soldiers. Religious leaders weren't spared from Amin's wrath. He had the Archbishop of Uganda murdered and displayed his severed head as a warning to others. Catholic priests were tortured and executed. Islamic leaders, despite Amin's own Muslim faith, were killed if they criticized his policies. Churches and mosques became targets for military raids. By 1975, Uganda's infrastructure was crumbling beyond repair. Hospitals had no medicine because the supply chains had been destroyed and foreign currency was unavailable for imports. Schools had no teachers because most educated people had been murdered or fled the country. Roads went unrepaired as the government focused all resources on maintaining Amin's military and security apparatus. International isolation became complete. The Organization of African Unity, usually reluctant to criticize African leaders, condemned Amin's regime. The United Nations imposed sanctions. Even Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, initially a supporter, eventually distanced himself from Amin's government. Uganda became a pariah state, cut off from international trade and investment. The final act of Amin's destructive reign came in 1978 when, desperate to distract from domestic problems, he decided to invade neighboring Tanzania. His poorly equipped and demoralized army was quickly defeated by Tanzanian forces supported by Ugandan exiles. As enemy troops marched toward Kampala, Amin's own military began to desert. His reign of terror was finally coming to an end. In April 1979, as Tanzanian forces and Ugandan liberation fighters entered Kampala, Amin fled to Libya and then to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in comfortable exile until his death in 2003. He never faced justice for his crimes, never showed remorse for the destruction he had caused, and never understood the magnitude of the suffering he had inflicted on his own people. The Uganda that Amin left behind was almost unrecognizable from the country he had inherited in 1971. An estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people had been murdered during his 8-year reign, roughly 5% of the entire population. The economy had contracted by more than 60%, making Uganda one of the poorest countries in the world. The infrastructure was in ruins, institutions had ceased to function, and social trust had been completely destroyed. It took Uganda decades to recover from Amin's rule. The country's first post-Amin government was weak and ineffective. Civil war erupted again in the 1980s. It wasn't until Yoweri Museveni came to power in 1986 that Uganda began the long process of rebuilding. Even today, more than 4 decades after Amin's fall, Uganda struggles with poverty, corruption, and the social trauma inflicted by his regime. The legacy of Idi Amin serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a single individual can destroy an entire nation's potential, and how long it takes for a society to heal from such systematic brutality. On October 12, 1968, Francisco Macías Nguema became the first president of newly independent Equatorial Guinea. Within a decade, he had transformed this small West African nation into what observers called the Dachau of Africa, a country so thoroughly destroyed that it became synonymous with madness and brutality. Macías Nguema's descent into tyranny began with paranoia about foreign influence. Despite Spanish being the colonial language, he banned its use and ordered all books burned in massive public bonfires. Libraries, schools, and churches were destroyed. He declared that anyone found reading would be executed for treason against the revolution. The persecution of intellectuals became systematic and horrifying. Teachers, doctors, and government officials were rounded up and executed. Macías Nguema personally participated in many executions, believing that drinking the blood of his enemies would give him their power. At one execution, he forced the entire population of Malabo, the capital, to watch as 150 government officials were hung from lampposts, while loudspeakers blasted "Those Were the Days" by Mary Hopkin. His paranoia extended to his own family. He ordered the execution of multiple wives, believing they were plotting against him. His brother and several children were murdered on his orders. Cabinet ministers lived in constant terror, never knowing if they would survive each meeting. Many committed suicide rather than face the inevitable torture and execution. The economic destruction was systematic and deliberate. Macías Nguema believed that money was a tool of foreign oppression, so he destroyed the banking system. All economic activity was banned except for subsistence farming. Professionals fled the country by the thousands, creating a massive brain drain. Those who couldn't escape were often murdered for attempting to leave. Religious persecution reached extreme levels. Catholic priests were crucified. Churches were converted into torture chambers. Macías Nguema declared himself the unique miracle and demanded to be worshipped as a god. Traditional African religions were also banned, as he saw them as competition to his divine authority. The international community completely abandoned Equatorial Guinea. Foreign embassies closed. International aid stopped. The country became so isolated that accurate information about the atrocities was nearly impossible to obtain. Radio and television were banned except for government propaganda, which consisted mainly of Macías Nguema's rambling speeches about his divine powers and threats against enemies. By 1979, Equatorial Guinea was a failed state. The population had dropped from 300,000 to less than 200,000 through murder and exile. The economy had ceased to exist. There was no currency, no industry, no schools, no hospitals. The infrastructure had completely collapsed. The capital city of Malabo was filled with abandoned buildings and mass graves. The end came when Macías Nguema's own nephew, Teodoro Obiang, led a military coup in August 1979. Macías Nguema was captured, tried for genocide and treason, and executed by firing squad on September 29, 1979. His final words reportedly were, "The rope with which you will hang me will disappear." The country Obiang inherited was perhaps the most thoroughly destroyed nation in modern African history. An estimated 1/3 of the population had been murdered or forced into exile. Every institution had been destroyed. The social fabric of the nation had been completely torn apart. Even today, over 4 decades later, Equatorial Guinea struggles with the legacy of Macías Nguema's reign of terror. Saddam Hussein's rise to power in Iraq began in 1979, but his systematic destruction of the country started even before he officially became president. As vice president under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Hussein had already begun the purges that would characterize his rule. On July 16, 1979, just days after becoming president, he staged one of the most chilling displays of political terror in modern history. Hussein called a meeting of the Ba'ath Party leadership, claiming he had discovered a Syrian plot against his government. As hundreds of party officials sat in the auditorium, Hussein read out a list of traitors. One by one, 68 men were escorted from the room by armed guards. The remaining officials, terrified for their lives, were forced to applaud as their colleagues were led away to execution. Many of these men had been Hussein's closest allies for decades. The message was clear: no one was safe from Saddam's paranoia. The purges expanded rapidly. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, military officers, government officials, intellectuals, religious leaders, was arrested, tortured, and often executed. The infamous Abu Ghraib prison became a symbol of state terror, where prisoners were subjected to rape, electrocution, and chemical torture. Hussein's war against his own people took on genocidal proportions during the Anfal campaign against Iraq's Kurdish population between 1986 and 1989. Using chemical weapons supplied by Western countries, his forces systematically destroyed Kurdish villages and murdered civilians. The most notorious attack occurred on March 16, 1988, in the town of Halabja, where chemical weapons killed over 5,000 civilians in a single day. Children were found dead in their mothers' arms, their faces contorted in agony from poison gas. The economic destruction of Iraq was equally systematic. Hussein's decision to invade Iran in 1980 began a devastating 8-year war that drained the country's resources and left over 1 million Iraqis dead or wounded. The war consumed an estimated $500 billion and left Iraq with massive foreign debt. Infrastructure was destroyed, and the economy shifted entirely to military production. Instead of rebuilding after the Iran-Iraq War, Hussein made an even more catastrophic decision. On August 2, 1990, he ordered the invasion of Kuwait, claiming it as Iraq's 19th province. The invasion was swift, but the international response was devastating. A coalition of 34 nations led by the United States launched Operation Desert Storm in January 1991. The Gulf War lasted only 42 days, but its impact on Iraq was catastrophic. Coalition forces destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure, including power plants, water treatment facilities, bridges, and telecommunications. The subsequent UN sanctions crippled the economy and led to widespread malnutrition and disease. An estimated 500,000 Iraqi children died from malnutrition and preventable diseases during the 1990s as a result of the sanctions. Hussein's response to internal uprisings after the Gulf War was characteristically brutal. When Shia Muslims in southern Iraq rebelled in March 1991, his forces used helicopter gunships to massacre civilians. Similar brutality was used against Kurdish uprisings in the north. Thousands more were killed, and hundreds of thousands fled as refugees. The final act of Hussein's destruction came with his decision to resist weapons inspections throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. His defiance, combined with claims about weapons of mass destruction, led to the 2003 US-led invasion that finally removed him from power. By then, Iraq had been transformed from a relatively prosperous, educated society into a broken nation plagued by violence, poverty, and sectarian conflict. When Hussein was finally captured in December 2003, hiding in a small underground bunker, the Iraq he left behind bore little resemblance to the country he had taken over in 1979. Decades of war, sanctions, and repression had left the infrastructure in ruins. The economy collapsed, and society fractured along sectarian and ethnic lines. His execution in 2006 marked the end of one of the most destructive dictatorships in modern Middle Eastern history. These dictators shared a common characteristic. They were so consumed by paranoia, megalomania, and cruelty that they systematically destroyed the very nations they claimed to serve. Pol Pot turned Cambodia into a killing field. Idi Amin reduced Uganda from the Pearl of Africa to an economic wasteland. Macías Nguema transformed Equatorial Guinea into what observers called a real-life hell on earth. Saddam Hussein's wars and brutality turned Iraq from a regional power into a failed state. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. Millions of lives lost, entire generations traumatized, and societies that still bear the scars of their destruction decades later. These weren't just dictators who oppressed their people. They were architects of national suicide, proving that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it can completely annihilate the very thing it seeks to control. What makes these cases even more tragic is that many of these countries had tremendous potential. Cambodia had a rich cultural heritage and fertile land. Uganda was blessed with natural resources and an educated population. Equatorial Guinea had oil wealth. Iraq had massive oil reserves and a literate society. Yet all of this was destroyed by the madness of single individuals drunk on absolute power. These stories serve as a reminder that freedom and democracy, however imperfect, are precious gifts that should never be taken for granted. The alternative, as these nations learned through unimaginable suffering, is too horrible to contemplate. If this video opened your eyes to the devastating impact of absolute power, make sure you're subscribed for more dark historical content. What other historical disasters would you like us to explore? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. And remember, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.